Okay, so if you've seen my channel, you probably know that I'm pretty well invested into the Neural DSP ecosystem. My main rig is a Quad Cortex. I've got the plugins. I've had a Nano Cortex. I bought capture packs. I'm pretty invested into this world. And because of that, a lot of the news around the new A2 version of the Neural Amp Modeler has been grabbing my attention. And we've seen a lot of opinions out there on it and its impact kind of on the modeling world. If you're not familiar with the Neural Amp Modeler, or NAM, the A2 version is the new version of it. It's basically an open source version of the neural capture process. And the general consensus is that the quality of the NAM captures is at least meeting a lot of those other capture technologies that are more proprietary. And so the expectation is that's going to have a big impact on this kind of market of these kind of devices. And it's got me thinking about what is this going to mean for Neural DSP? And I wanted to kind of talk about that a little bit here today. The first thing I want to touch on, though, is, we're talking about the capture technologies. There's still the modeling world where you've got kind of digital versions of devices that you have full control over. Remember, when you're doing captures or tone models, it's a point-in-time capture of however that amp was set or however that overdrive was set, at that point in time. And you're kind of at the mercy of the skill of the person creating that capture. Are they able to capture that device in the right way that makes it sound the best? So there's a lot of variance in the qualities of the captures. So that's always something to keep in mind. When you're talking about more the modeling, which the Quad Cortex does, Line 6 obviously has models for a long time, Fractal does it great, those are a different kind of beast. And of course, I've seen some thoughts online we're talking about, is that going to die off? I don't think that it is. I think that modelers are still going to be around. If you look at the investment that Neural DSP is making into the plugin, say the new John Mayer plugin, eventually that's going to be ported over to the Quad Cortex, I think, with the next release. Those are still big deals. And you get that full tweakability of the amp with those models. And I don't think that's going to go away. But for today's discussion, we're going to focus in on the capture aspect and kind of put the models aside and think about the impact of this new open source capturing technology. So we look here, these are some of the statistics that the NAM site has been putting out in terms of the quality of their new A2 captures. And you can see there's two here, there's the light, there's the full. So there's kind of a variable quality version of the captures that allows you to kind of scale down the capture in order to run it on less powerful hardware. And that's definitely an important part of this. We've seen that a little bit with the Quad Cortex, where the V2 captures in the Quad Cortex are chewing up a lot more CPU power. And so it's nice that NAM's created ability to kind of scale down some of these captures so that you can use the capture with a setting that's going to run best on the equipment you're using. But whether or not you think that this scoring is 100% the truth, my point would be that I think we can say that the quality of the NAM captures is at least equal to what you get from Neural DSP, what you're getting from Tonex. You might quibble over maybe the V2 captures are a little bit better here or the NAM captures are a little bit better there. I don't want to get into that today. I'm just going to move ahead on the assumption that there's a parity here. So now you have an open source technology that is equal to the capture technologies or the tone modeling or whatever you want to call it from the proprietary vendors. And what is that going to mean for the market overall and definitely for Neural DSP? But before we dig in, just a reminder, if you can hit the like button, maybe leave a comment. That kind of thing really helps the analytics of small channels like mine. If you like this kind of content, consider subscribing. And if you want to support the channel, there's a couple affiliate links in the description below. But let's start out by thinking about kind of what are the factors we think about when we're comparing these devices in a competitive sense. Obviously, one is what's the quality of the amps or the overdrives, the tones that we're getting out of the device. That's probably the top thing. Does it sound good? The other thing would be, what's the quantity that we can get? Do we have a good library of amps that we can have options in terms of, I want a Dumble style amp, or I want a Marshall style amp, or a Fender, or a Vox, or a 5150, or whatever you might want. Can I find the kind of amp that I want to use? And I think these two aspects are really where, at least in the capture technology, NAM is going to kind of bring a parity across different platforms. So if you get to the point where all these platforms are supporting the NAM function, and I don't know how long the vendors are going to hold off in terms of having NAM compatibility, but I got to believe that as soon as one of them breaks and does it, the other ones are going to have to follow suit. And what that's going to do is going to bring a parity in terms of the quality and the quantity of devices you can get across these platforms. So then beyond that, what are the ways we're going to compare these devices? One is obviously the nonlinear effects, the things you can't capture. Reverbs, delays, modulations, pitch shifts, all that kind of stuff. How good are the effects? The other one's going to be, what's the overall processing power of the devices? So again, we've seen that with the V2 captures in the Quad Cortex. You're definitely cut down on the number of captures you can use in a single preset just because of the processing power limitations. So there's definitely going to be room for saying, hey, this device is the most powerful. You can run this many captures at the same time. I think user experience and workflows is going to become a much bigger aspect of why you choose a device. Where now a lot of times you're picking the ones that are going to sound the best and have the best effects, and the user experience and workflow is just kind of an afterthought. Now it's really more about, okay, if I have a parity in terms of the amp tones, I'm going to want a device that works with how I want to work with it. So the software, how you interact with it on the device, that kind of thing. The form factor is always going to be part of this. So this is where you're talking about what size device you want. Some people like the Quad Cortex Mini because it's smaller and it fits on a pedal board easier. Some people want the bigger device. Some people even complain the Quad Cortex isn't big enough because sometimes you hit a button you're not meaning to when you're switching around during a gig, and they want a bigger device that maybe has an expression pedal built in, that kind of thing. So form factor is going to be an interesting thing that companies are going to have to play with. And then obviously price. If you're getting parity on all the amps that are available, is there more pressure on these companies to have a more competitive price? So let's talk about how Neural DSP and some of the other vendors would fit in to this kind of criteria. If we talk about Neural, the first thing I would say in terms of nonlinear effects, the effects on the Quad Cortex are good. They are not great. I think a lot of people would consider the effects on the Fractal and on Line 6 are better than you get on the Quad Cortex. So I really think that this is something that Neural DSP needs to invest maybe a little bit more in, kind of bring the quality of those effects up. In terms of processing power, I do think the Quad Cortex is a pretty powerful device. Obviously, like I said, the V2 captures are starting to suck up more CPU. I do think in the next few years, we should see a new version of the Quad Cortex that's got more processing power on it so you can run more captures at the same time. In terms of experience or workflow, I love the Neural DSP kind of user interface. To me, that's one of the key aspects where I think Neural DSP is kind of ahead of some of the other companies. Obviously, opinions vary, but my experience with Tonex and Fractal and Line 6 is, they've got good software, but I feel like there's a higher learning curve, especially for companies like Fractal, than there is for the Quad Cortex. I feel like for the Quad Cortex, you can kind of jump in and get going easier. So I really prefer the UX workflow, and I think that's a strong kind of competitive advantage for Neural DSP. But obviously, they need to keep that up. They need to stay ahead there. Form factor, we already talked about that. It's really based on personal preference. Price-wise, I do think the Quad Cortex right now is priced pretty competitively. When you see some of the new things from Line 6 with the Stadium, when you see the pricing on, say, the Fractal FM9, I think they're pretty well positioned in terms of price. When we think about Fractal, I think this is pretty interesting because Fractal is one of the only companies that doesn't have a competing capability in terms of captures or tone models. And so for them to add in compatibility with NAM captures, I think is just a no-brainer. They don't have a competing technology. Add this in, and all of a sudden you have this big library of captures to add to a huge library of really good amp models and really good nonlinear effects. And so I think Fractal is one of the most well-positioned to just kind of take on compatibility of NAM and use it as a competitive advantage. And I almost would expect maybe they'll be the first to get compatibility for that because they haven't done a lot of R&D investment into their own capture technology. Tonex obviously is built all around their capture technology. And so I think this might hurt them as much as Neural DSP. Because the Tonex, the tone model technology is kind of the key to their platform. And if you have this new open source platform that you can use models across devices, are people going to choose the Tonex devices based on all these other attributes? I'm not sure. So it'll be interesting to see what the NAM compatibility starts to do for Tonex. You've got line 6, who is just kind of putting a foot into this kind of capture world with their new proxy on the stadium. And so I wonder if they're going to be willing to jump onto NAM when they've just spent a lot of R&D kind of creating their own. I haven't used the stadium, so I haven't tried out how good the proxies are, but maybe they just switched towards NAM. Maybe they abandoned the proxy because it really hasn't gotten off the ground yet. So it'll be interesting to see what's there. Again, like Fractal, you've got a big library of great models. You've got a big library of really good nonlinear effects. The workflow is pretty good, and they've got a lot of different price points. So I think they could definitely benefit from introducing NAM compatibility. And so I think those are the big ones that are kind of the most popular right now. But you've got the other ones that are still out there. So obviously you've got Kemper. Their whole platform is built around their profiling. And so if they introduce NAM compatibility, I just wonder where that leaves them. You've got Fender with the Tonemaster, which I don't think has really gotten tons of traction. And if they introduce NAM compatibility, that might be something that allows them to kind of get into that top tier of the model world. And then you have kind of the smaller vendors. You've got Nuix, you've got Hotone with their Ampero, which they've started doing their own capture technology as well, but they could quickly kind of abandon that and go to the NAM compatibility. And you've got Dark Class, which just released a device that has NAM compatibility. And so it'd be interesting to see, is there a kind of a new entrant that'll come in and leverage the NAM open source to kind of be a kind of a kickstart to move their modeling device into that kind of top tier. So I think about vendors, say like Strymon, who built the Iridium a few years ago, which has really kind of fallen off a little bit. It's a great little device, but they have great effects and things like that that they make. If they took those, built a multi-effects processor, and introduced NAM compatibility, they could be a pretty strong contender in here, in my opinion. And so it'll be interesting to see, is there a new kind of entrant into this market that can come in, kind of like Tonex did, and kind of push themselves into that conversation for some of the best devices. But overall, I think for Neural, I have a little bit of concern just because they're so built on their capture technology in terms of being one of their differentiator. If instead you've got this NAM compatibility across devices, I think Neural's going to have to invest more in their nonlinear effects, making sure their workflow stays kind of top tier, making their devices more powerful. I think they're going to have to invest in other areas, which is going to be interesting because that's not kind of the core of what they did. So obviously the plugins and the models are still there to differentiate them in some ways, but I think the capture technology has kind of been devalued now. So I'll be interested to see what happens with Neural and where they go with this. But overall, I'm really interested to see the effect that NAM has on this overall market. I'm excited to see where it goes. I think the next 2 years are going to be very interesting. And like I said, I'll be interested to see which vendor, other than smaller ones like Dark Glass, really jump in with that NAM compatibility and start to push others to have to do it as well. And then we'll see kind of where the market shakeup ends up. So if you stay for this whole video, I appreciate you kind of listening to me ramble about this. Obviously, this is something that interests me a lot. I hope you found this interesting as well. If you did, leave a comment below. Let me know kind of what you think is going to happen in terms of the effect that NAM will have on the market and which devices you hope introduce NAM compatibility. As always, thanks for watching.